You still have a few minutes to rush your meal while I'm talking, so make the most of it. First, the usual housekeeping rules. Remember to turn off your phone if you haven't done it yet. I'm doing it as well. And I'll quickly tell you about the coming up events. We have a very busy week coming up. The 25th is the Bling Dynasty, while the reign of Chinese luxury shoppers has only just begun. The next day, Friday, we'll host Benny Tai. Will Hong Kong ever have genuine democracy? And then the following Monday, we'll have a speaker about money laundering. So make the most of all of these dates. Finally, our speaker today, a policeman. We don't have too many policemen visiting the club, thank God, on a regular basis. But this one is a very nice one. Chris is a retired police officer. He joined the Hong Kong police force in 1970. He was with the UK police force before, and then he left in 1998, and he actually has not been back for 16 years in Hong Kong. So Chris has been a first-hand witness to fascinating years, including, of course, the creation of ICAC, which is now very important in Hong Kong identity. But the best news of it, for what Mr. Emmett told me, is that it is apparently mainly a funny book. And his editor had to tell him to make it a bit less funny. So we'll hear about all this. And without further ado, please welcome Mr. Emmett.
Well, thank you, Florence, and thank you to the FCC for this wonderful lunch, and thanking you all to come to hear me speak today. Now, actually, normally I would be intimidated by a room full of journalists, but I'm told you're very nice journalists, and so I've got nothing to worry about on that score. But not all of my ex-colleagues were intimidated by journalists. In fact, some of them were masters of the perfect soundbite. And I'm reminded of a good old mate of mine who was a detective chief inspector in Sam Sui Po. And he received word that there'd been an armed robbery in his division, so he got in his staff car and he rushed out to the scene, where he was met by a phalanx of reporters, and they shoved microphones at him and cameras and lights, and somebody shouted out, "Chief Inspector, do you know who committed this robbery?" And without a second's hesitation, he said, "We believe this robbery was committed by armed thieves, acting with a view to financial gain." There were no more questions after that. But in 1970, I was just an English bobby in the small town of Warrington in the northwest of England. And I read an advertisement calling for police inspectors in Hong Kong. Well, I was 22 years old, so I put in my application, and I arrived in November that year. And during the next 28 years, I worked in a general uniform. I was with the police tactical unit, the Blue Berets, 3 times. I worked I prosecuted in court. I was in general CID as a detective, and I went on to the Narcotics Bureau, where I dealt with the case of the Mao brothers, where the owner of the Oriental Daily News, we found he was being rather naughty with 29 tons of opium and heroin. After that, life wasn't all an adventure. My promotion trail took me on a number of mundane office posts, but all in all, the 28 years was an amazing journey. Now, when I joined the Hong Kong Police, the force was a paramilitary colonial police force. And like all colonial police forces, the top ranks were filled entirely by British expatriate officers. But the force was changing. And by the time I retired, the Hong Kong Police had become a civil force commanded by locally recruited Chinese officers. Now, the force stopped recruiting overseas officers in 1994, which means that the last expatriate officer will leave in about 2024. Now, like a lot of police officers, I struggled a bit with retirement because being a policeman is not what you do, it's what you are. And then, shortly after I retired, a group of ex-Essex County police officers asked me to perform an after-dinner speech. So I thought, all right, I'd never kept any diary, so I'll jot down a few ideas. And it was like a row of dominoes going over. One idea led to another. And I was writing this after-dinner speech for 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, in about year 2000, the first draft of my book, Hong Kong Policeman, was ready. Now, at first, the book was just a kind of romp through some of the crazier events that happened during my first 7 years, and it was a catalogue of the glorious characters I met. But my publisher, Graham Earnshaw, he said, look, Chris, it just needs a little bit of work. Now, that's publisher code for this needs a lot of work. So after more rewrites than I tend to think about, the book is now a balance between the humorous and the serious. Now, the book is peppered with references to Hong Kong people who are totally astonishing. Hong Kong people have on average the world's highest IQ. They'll haggle over the price of a matchbox, but they're one of the world's most generous donors to charity. And not only are the people special, but also some of the institutions as well. For example, the Hong Kong Police. During the colonial era, the Royal Hong Kong Police crest had at its centre a harbour view, and there was a clipper ship in the harbour, and on the jetty there were two men, one wearing a top hat and a long frock coat, and the other wearing a long Chinese gown. And sharing the jetty with them was a row of chests. And this scene was at the heart of the Royal Hong Kong Police cap badge. Now we know that half the chest would have contained tea, and the other half would have contained opium, which meant for 150 years the Hong Kong Police was celebrating a drugs deal. But despite all this charming, shall we call it, eccentricity, the Hong Kong people are remarkably resilient. And after 28 years, I came to accept a challenge as a normal course of events. And then I retired to Yorkshire. And in Yorkshire, there is a militant resistance to change. Shortly after I retired, I took a drive up into the Yorkshire Dales National Park, which is a wonderful area of scenic beauty. And we came across a wonderful little village where there were a few houses, a pub, and a village store. And above the window of the village store, there was the name of the proprietor and his telephone number. And it was a 3-digit telephone number. So I had a few purchases to make, so I went into the shop and made my purchases, and I couldn't resist mentioning this 3-digit telephone number. And he looked at me and he scratched his chin and he said, "Aye, lad, that's progress for you." But Hong Kong people, they revel in change. And since World War II, we've seen violent upheaval in the 50s and 60s. We've seen economic boom and bust, natural disasters in the form of typhoons and floods. We've seen fires, major changes in the way that we're governed, and we've even seen a change in national sovereignty. And Hong Kong people respond to all this challenge by just getting on with life. The science fiction writer Robert Heinlein, in his book The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, put forward the idea that if you put two Hong Kongers into a lunar crater, they'd make a fortune selling rocks to each other. And he got it right, because Hong Kong people always manage to turn adversity into opportunity. Now, I always considered the Hong Kong to be the quintessential multicultural society. But in a multicultural society, there's sometimes a few communications issues. And I mentioned in the book how the police developed its own language to bridge this communication gap. And it was kind of cross between English, Chinese, and acronyms. And I don't care if you speak English or if you speak Chinese or if you speak both. If you listen to two cops talking to each other, you'd have no idea what they were talking about. So, for example, the case, the phrase, "Do you have the investigation file for the assault occasioning actual bodily harm case?" would become, "Le llamo AOBH case hilo." Yeah, anybody get that? The acronyms themselves were quite wonderful. The simple ones, like dangerous drugs, was DD. My boss, the district commander, would be the DC, regional commander, the RC, and so on. And then when I was a detective senior inspector, there was a horse doping case in Happy Valley, and police headquarters set up a special investigation unit under the Triad Society Bureau to investigate it. And on that day, I became the DSIPA, TSB, SIU, CID, PHQ. This was one of these wonderful Emperor's New Clothes posts, because nobody knew what the hell I was doing, but nobody would admit it. And so I'd be in the lift at police headquarters, and a boss would get in. I've got inside of me this little voice, and it acts like a conscience, only in reverse, and it's always getting me into trouble. And this boss would say, "Oh, it's young Emmett. What are you doing now?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'm the DSIPA, TSB, SIU, CID, PHQ, sir." And the whole lift would go quiet, and the boss's neck would go a bit red, and he'd say, "Oh, very good, carry on." Later on, as a superintendent, I became the full staff officer discipline, which meant I had to sign my memos, CR Emmett, SOD. And when, again, as a superintendent, I was commanding a tactical unit company, and we were based at the old airport police station at Kai Tak. And the airport division then had a very small CID unit, and within that small CID unit, there was a small divisional intelligence section and district anti-triad. And so the plaque on their door read DIS, DIS, and DAT, DAT. Now, when I talk of police officers in the Hong Kong context, I refer to officers of all ranks, from constable to commissioner, male, female, and of all ethnic background, Chinese, Western, Pakistani, Indian, everybody. And police officers are first and foremost members of the community, and a police force should reflect that community. Now, my basic training in the United Kingdom and here in Hong Kong gave a formal definition of a police officer, and it was a citizen, locally appointed, but having authority for the protection of life and property, the prevention and detection of crime, and the maintenance of order. And I did that without looking at my notes, so I was very well taught. But the order of words there is not an accident. It's a hierarchy. A police officer is a citizen, first and foremost. Now, we see only the uniform, but a police officer has every bit as much personal investment in the society as do the rest of us. And the Hong Kong police force, like all good police forces, was and still is a mirror image of Hong Kong society. Now, the command of the force is now primarily in the hands of locally recruited Chinese officers. But of course, it wasn't always so. Before the war, and through the 50s and 1960s, not only the police, but all of Hong Kong society was immersed in the colonial way of life. British expatriates headed the major private institutions, the civil service, and of course the police force. Now, colonialism wasn't all bad, and it laid the groundwork for our cherished institutions such as the rule of law, free speech, an independent judiciary, and honest government, mostly. And in my book, I give a potted history of how Hong Kong changed from being a colonial outpost to a cosmopolitan powerhouse. Now, after the 1945 liberation, there was grudging recognition that the colonial system was fundamentally unfair for local Chinese. But in the 1950s, and particularly in the 1960s, China itself was in turmoil. And Hong Kong's visible colonial institutions, including uniformed expatriate police officers, were Hong Kong's stable bedrock. Now, things started to change in the 1960s, but the pace of localization was still slow. Chinese had a hard time of progressing to the top of any organization, and the same was true of the police force. And I often heard the complaint, it's very hard for us local boys. And I wanted desperately to deny that, but I couldn't, because it was true. And in fact, up to 1970, local expatriate officers were paid an expatriate allowance, which meant that expatriate officers were paid more for doing the same job as their Chinese counterparts. Now, in 1970, government gave a general pay rise, and they incorporated this expatriate allowance into the pay rise. That meant it disappeared, and the inequality between the expatriate and the local pay disappeared. So, in the following years, I noticed changes in Hong Kong society. China, of course, started to liberalize. There was secondary education for all, and there was a growing sense of aspiration. Now, with this growing aspiration, the government and the police had to change. The colonial style of government was becoming outmoded. So talented Chinese officers were singled out for enhanced training, primarily overseas training, and they were singled out for being placed in difficult, demanding command posts. Now, some fell by the wayside, but those who succeeded received well-deserved promotion. And slowly, the imbalance between overseas and Chinese officers became redressed. And in 1989, Lei Kuan-ha became our first Chinese commissioner. I'm often asked if the process of localization in any way diminished or meant the status of the expatriates was diminished in any way. It was never a question I was comfortable with, because as an expatriate, I never felt special or in any way different. Expatriates and locals, we were all the same professionals doing the job as best we could. And one thing I hope that comes across in my book is the strong working relationship between the expatriates and the local officers. Now, politically, Hong Kong is coming of age. During the early years of the district boards in the early 1980s, election turnout was absolutely abysmal, and it continued that way until about 1989. And then came the Tiananmen incident, and everything changed. We saw a series of mass protests that set a world precedent not only in their scale, but also in the dignity of the way they were carried out. Organizations coordinated their actions with the police, and they came about a kind of partnership that saw mass demonstrations carried out in a way that was peaceful and presented the minimum amount of disruption to the wider community. Turnout in elections improved, and by 2012, the turnout for the LegCo election was about 53 and a bit percent of the total electorate. If you compare this to 2012 in the USA, where the turnout was 57%. So Hong Kong pretty much on a par with the USA in terms of political engagement. We recently saw huge numbers of people signing up for the pro-democracy referendum, and there are also huge numbers of people who signed up for petitions that held a counter view. So what we have is political diversity, but carried out in a way that is dignified, mature, and sensible. Now, in this climate of growing political awareness, some say the police force is becoming increasingly politicized. Now, I've got to say this. There have always been those who seek to manipulate or politicize the police to further their own political agendas. I saw this throughout my career, even from my early days in the New Territories. I saw it with the Kai Phong associations, the mutual aid committees, the district boards that later became the district councils, fight crime committees, and the legislative council. And within these groups, there are elements who happily use the police as a political football to further their own political ends. For example, liberals will complain about police intrusion into private life in order to gain favor with like-minded groups. Conservatives will favor the police in order to be seen to be strong on community values. And within each district, there are issues unique to that district where the same problems crop up. Now, all of these groups express their views very robustly, and it's not much fun being a police officer caught in the middle of it all. But the police must steer a careful path to avoid being accused of being partisan. However, no matter how hard they try, the police will always be accused of political bias. And in my experience, and in the experience of some serving officers who I've been speaking to recently, these accusations invariably originate from groups who overstep legal boundaries and as a result come into conflict with the police. So it's vital that not only everyday citizens, but also community leaders, legislators, and those who seek to influence the way in which we select our future legislators abide by the law. Not some laws, all laws. No one, not you, not me, not the government, not the police, not any political activist of any hue, no one can cherry-pick the laws that they want to obey and disregard others that suit them, or they face the chance of being arrested, as do we all. Now, when the police make a decision that they're going to take action against political activists, they know they are going to face accusations of being politically motivated. But this won't stop them from taking action. An effective police force needs the courage to ignore threats of a political backlash. Now, the Hong Kong police should not, and I hope it does not, place any weight on political considerations. It should instead treat everyone as being equal in the eyes of the law. Now, I now live in North Yorkshire, and last month the South Yorkshire Police and the South Yorkshire Social Services came in for a lot of criticism. An inquiry found that they'd failed to act against a group of 50 Pakistani British males who had systematically been abusing young girls for 16 years. A number of 1,400 girls has been banded around. These were young girls who were seen as being vulnerable because they were unruly and they were in the care of the local social services. Some were as young as 11. There's talks of them being raped, trafficked into prostitution, passed around this gang of males. And the police and the social services did nothing. They'd received information for years. They never investigated it, they never sought evidence. Why? Because they feared being accused of racism. They feared the backlash from the Asian community, the political backlash from the Asian community. And that's where I see a difference between the Hong Kong police and the South Yorkshire police. It's a difference between a weak and fearful leadership and strong, decisive leadership. Now, I'm minded of advice I received from my old sergeant when I was a 19-year-old constable in Merseyside. And he said, "Listen here, young un, if either side of an argument thinks you're a fine fellow, you've done it all wrong. If both sides think you're a bastard, then you've been handling things in an even-handed manner." So, where are we now? Hong Kong's colonial legacy of free will and liberal values is not uniquely British. It's ingrained in all of us, regardless of our ethnic background, our professions, or our status within society. Now, the Hong Kong police you see on the streets today has evolved over a period of 170 years. And earlier, I called them citizen police officers. And I'm asked, will these citizen police officers be willing to use force against disorderly pro-democracy demonstrators? Now, I believe yes, but they will only do it as a last resort to support the rule of law and maintain public order. And on today's police guidelines, they will never be asked to use anything more than the minimum force in order to achieve the necessary outcome. The men and women of today's Hong Kong police are more than equal to any task that's put before them. Now, Hong Kong's colonial era coincided with a time of great turmoil in China. From the Taiping Rebellion through to the founding of the Republic, communist victory over the KMT, and beyond to Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward and his Cultural Revolution. No matter what your views, these 150 years under Hong Kong and British rule was an oasis of calm and stability. And the presence of expatriate officers on the streets of Hong Kong was a symbol of British law and justice. Now, the expatriate element is now in decline. But the principles of good policing remain. Now, some say that Hong Kong has Asia's finest police force. In my book, I invite the readers to go a little further than that. I ask the readers to look at Hong Kong police's heritage, its values, its training, its constant re-evaluation, and its willingness to accept change. And most importantly, its place within the community. And these are what make the Hong Kong police equal to any police force in the world. I'm sometimes asked, do police officers love Hong Kong? It's complex. Police officers often see a lot of life's ugly side, and this can make them very cynical. But there's also a shared pride in the way that the Hong Kong police keep the streets of Hong Kong safe. And as a police officer, I often felt these positives and negatives all kind of bundled up inside of me. But it's these feelings that give the police officer a complex but a very special relationship with the city in which they work. Now, in the past, Hong Kong was a British-Chinese hybrid. But the police force then reflected society of its time. But as the British role in Hong Kong society diminishes, so it follows that the British element in the police force must also diminish. It's not quite over yet. There's still about 120 expatriates in the force, some in senior ranks. In fact, there are 3 expatriate assistant commissioners in the force, one of whom is in overall command of Kowloon West Region. But as the expat numbers is inevitable, it's part of the ongoing evolution of Hong Kong and of the police force that reflects that evolution. So what's the expat legacy? In 2011, a Hong Kong police delegation visited the Chinese Public Security Ministry in Beijing. And in an after-dinner speech, the Public Security Minister made a point of thanking those overseas officers for helping to make the transfer to Chinese rule so successful. So today's Hong Kong is very much a product of its history. And I'm proud to have been part of that history, as should all expatriate officers, both past and present. Now, Hong Kong is now in a period of some anxiety. Hong Kong's been in periods of anxiety before and has come through it stronger. But there's a sense that this time it's different. Now, I'm not a 5-day expert. I've got no idea how Hong Kong is going to come out of this. I can only hope that a solution is found that engages the Hong Kong people and allows the Hong Kong people to move forward as part of that solution. There is so much in this town to be optimistic about. And if a solution to our current problems can be found, Hong Kong will have a very bright future. Now, there are 2 things wrong with journalists. The first thing is they ask questions. The second thing is they bloody well expect answers. So I will do my very best to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was excellent. Of course, I have questions, but I will leave priority to the floor. Yes. Please introduce yourself before you ask the question.
Peter Bozar, retired foreign correspondent. Per your comment that the police force should reflect the community, and given Hong Kong's diversity in terms of culture and race, it's recently been noted that non-Chinese people will no longer be recruited into the Hong Kong police force. How do you feel about that?
I think a police force should reflect the community. When I left the UK police force, there was not a single black or Asian face in the whole of the United Kingdom police forces. We now live in more enlightened times, and that's very much different. The Hong Kong police force should reflect the ethnic diversity of Hong Kong. But it's not unreasonable to expect that police officers speak the language of 98% of the population. Now, I understand the Commissioner does want to increase the ethnic diversity in Hong Kong, but it's going very slowly. I understand there's been a couple of Indian officers recruited recently that passed the language qualifications, but I think the force has got some way further to go, and I think it should continue along that path.
Thank you. Tom Holland. I work for a research company, Dragonomics. I'm interested in your opinion. In recent years, there's been an enormous divergence between the calculation of numbers of attendees at public demonstrations, the numbers calculated by the organizers, which I assume, one assumes naturally are exaggerated, and the numbers estimated by the police, which in some cases have been absurdly understated, and not just compared to the organizers' estimates, but also to independent estimates taken using aerial photos by academic statisticians at the University of Hong Kong. And this appears to many people in Hong Kong as blatant evidence of an overt political stance on the part of the police force. I mean, in some cases, the understatement of numbers of attendees at demonstrations is absolutely ludicrous. I just wondered what your thoughts on this divergence might be.
The divergence has not occurred over the last few years. It's been going on for as long as I was a police officer in Hong Kong. I mean, I can only speak from my own point of view. And there was never any formal calculation for doing it when I was in the job. And basically, you'd take a look at the 100 square meter block and you'd estimate how many people were in it, then you'd see how big it was and you multiply it and you come out with a number. And it was always lower than the number estimated by the organizers. As far as whether this is blatant politicization of the police force, I can't comment. All I do know is that activists have always exaggerated the numbers when I've done operations, and I've always presented numbers that I thought were accurate, but they've always been below those of the activists. And that's always just been a fact of operational life.
Than estimates compiled by exactly the methods that you describe.
I couldn't comment. I wasn't here.
Thank you. Maybe I'll squeeze in one question. I'd like to hear a bit more about the creation of ICAC, because you joined in 70 and it was created in 74, and I think even in 78 there was like a purge of more than 100 officers who were were sacked basically. So you would have seen this firsthand. Can you tell us a bit more what was the corruption like when you arrived and along the years you've been there?
Corruption, when I arrived, was very widespread throughout the government and particularly in the police force. There was a police force anti-corruption branch, which wasn't all that effective, primarily because the evidence required to prove corruption was very difficult to get. Police general orders said that any officers who had information on corruption had to pass it up, with or without evidence, but then it was only a disciplinary matter. But in the early 1970s, 73, we borrowed the corruption legislation from Singapore. And the Singapore legislation, the key issues were that an officer who had a lifestyle or who had financial resources not commensurate with his income was guilty of an offence. Secondly, a corruption offence could be prosecuted without any corroborating evidence at all. Now, those first, what we call pecuniary resources and lifestyle offences, that changed the whole ballgame. Anti-corruption branch immediately started making some very high-level arrests. Then, unfortunately, Peter Godber was detained, he was searched, his passport was seized, he was put on the watch list, and what was overlooked was the fact that he had an airport closed area permit, which meant he could go into the airport, he could bypass customs, immigration, which he quite duly did, got on an aeroplane, said goodbye to Hong Kong, and doesn't send any Christmas cards. There was an outrage. The police were blamed for letting him go, I think probably unfairly, but as it transpired, within, I think, 18 months, the ICAC was formed. Now, initially, it was what the Chinese would say, old wine in new bottles. They were police officers transferred over to the ICAC. But that didn't last for very long. There then became a recruiting process from the United Kingdom. A lot of UK police officers came over. And then, of course, a local recruiting exercise started. And now the ICAC is primarily local officers. It was very, very effective. There were a number of very high-profile trials. Corruption didn't end immediately, but it would become a shadow of its former self. There'll always be corruption in a big police force like ours, but the days of systemic, deep, widespread corruption were over.
So you've left, you haven't been back in Hong Kong for 16 years, but you have a lot of friends and former colleagues in the policing system.
Yes, I've still got some old friends I meet. I trained in 1970. I'm meeting an old squad mate of mine on Friday. A lot of officers who I served with in 1998 are still serving, and I've been in touch with them before I came out here to find out what the current situation was in Hong Kong and what's happening with the police. They're still serving. I remember them as being very young, fresh-faced officers. Most of them are retiring within the next 2 years, which makes me feel really old. But yes, it's nice to catch up with old friends. My wife Stephanie's been catching up with old work colleagues of hers, and it's great. And the people are great. I've been fiddling around. The MTR ticketing system has changed. And I'm there, and this old guy there trying to figure out how this MTR ticket, and someone always stops and helps. And that was really nice.
I wonder, though, since the handover, that if your colleagues have gotten a sense that there is any kind of pressure or things that have slightly shifted in terms of, the former colony being British and then now it's mainland China.
No, because those who decided to stay knew what the score was. A lot of officers took the option of taking early retirement in 1997, but those who stayed knew what they were in for. They found particularly now, a lot of them are more senior, and they're attending the district meetings, the district fight crime committee meetings. They find people are quite happy to see them. The relationship between the locals and the expatriates is still very strong. I found the day after the handover, the relationship between the expatriates and the local community changed. And I'd never noticed it before. But somehow, on that first day after the handover, we suddenly became Jigeyan. We were all together. And it was a really nice, warm feeling. And I can't point to it and say, this happened and this happened. You walk into a shop, and the shopkeeper would have a little joke with you. And it was really nice. I don't know whether it's still the same, but I know the colleagues I spoke to, they're very happy.
Do they ever speak to mainland China? Or is it hands-off?
There are liaison officers for dealing with mainland China. I know before the handover, some of my colleagues worked with the Public Security Bureau on cross-border crime, found the PSB very, very, very professional. There was a case where there was a robbery on board a Macau ferry, and it involved 3 police forces, the PSB, Chinese PSB, Hong Kong police, and Macau police. And my colleagues who worked with the PSB, because they found a mobile phone left by one of the robbers, and the liaison between the PSB and the Hong Kong police, very good. And that was before the handover.
We got another question, otherwise I'll take it. You mentioned a delegation to China in 2011. Do you think there is any chance that, just as Singapore inspired Hong Kong to put in an anti-corruption efficient force, the Hong Kong model would be used for China?
I would like to see China adopting a lot of Hong Kong policies. And I don't think we'll go any further than that. Australia adopted Singapore's anti-corruption laws. They are draconian. The main worry that policemen used to have is if they arrested a drug addict, that drug addict could go to the ICAC, said the police officer shut me down for $500, and on that evidence alone, legally, the officer could be prosecuted and convicted. No corruption cases were ever taken to a jury. It was all heard before a district court case. The ICAC are, of course, much more sensible than that, so they were very cautious about taking cases like that to court. But it would have been possible. Whether that would be a good idea in a country like China, I'm not sure. Maybe because there should be some more safeguards.
Great. Unless we have one little last... Okay. Thank you.
One quick question about the ICAC. I guess there's been a lot of talk about the Jimmy Lai arrest.
Sorry, your mic switched up. I can't hear you.
Sorry, now you can hear me. Jimmy Lai's arrest, there's been a lot of talk, not arrest, ICAC investigation, a lot of talk that this is very politicized, and because of your background in the ICAC, or watching information that I want to ask your opinion about that case.
Well, I wasn't ICAC, and Jimmy Lai's case occurred whilst I was away. I really just heard about it this morning. I've not been following the Hong Kong newspapers the way I should, so I'm afraid I would like to answer that, but I couldn't give you an authoritative answer on it, so I won't.
Do you recall accusations in the past, in the 80s or something, where someone said, that was a politicized move on the part of the ICAC, or is this fresh?
I've been accused of being politicized. In East Kowloon, there was a pro-democracy event organised by a district board member, and I warned him that this massive PA system he was putting up required a licence. And I got earache up to here. I was an old colonialist. I was stamping on the voice of the people. He complained to my district commander, who was going to go to the Complaints Against Police Office, and all I said was, you need a licence for your PA system. So it's always been there.
Well, I think we should finish on this because we all look at finishing on the spot, but we should all thank you very much for this inspiring talk, and feel free, not free, but please buy the book, and join me in thanking Chris for this speech.
Thank you. We were talking about the ICAC a minute ago. Do I?
I know.
Thank you, everybody. You've been very gracious. Thank you, John.